In this lecture, you will learn about voting rights, the Monroe Administration, the Missouri Compromise, the Monroe Doctrine, and the election of 1824. One of the most significant issues during the 1800s was the issue of voting rights. Presidential elections occur at the Electoral College, and they were removed from ordinary voters. However, during this time period, we will begin to see a call for a greater democratization of presidential elections. And according to some, the property land qualifications that were in place at the time was perhaps the biggest obstacle to a greater democracy. In the 1780s, 12 of the 13 original states enacted landed property qualifications for voting. In the 1790s, Vermont became the first state to enfranchise all adult males, and 4 more states soon broadened suffrage considerably. Some of the new western states abandoned property qualifications altogether. Several states managed to delay expanded suffrage for 2 more decades, but landowners found it increasingly difficult to justify the notion that only they had the stake in government. As states were slowly expanding suffrage for non-property owners, another president will be elected to the presidency, President Monroe. Although Monroe was a Jeffersonian, some of his principles echoed Federalist policies. Whereas Jefferson cut the size of the military and ended all internal taxes in his first term, Monroe advocated the need for a strong military and an aggressive foreign policy. For example, since Americans were spreading out all over the continent, Monroe decided that he needed to authorize the federal government to invest in canals and roads. Moreover, under the Monroe administration, we will see a strengthening of the federal government to strengthen the nation. One of Monroe's first challenges, for example, will be an international crisis when, in 1816, American troops led by General Andrew Jackson invaded Spanish Florida in search of Seminole Indians harboring escaped slaves. Once there, Jackson declared himself the commander of Norton, Florida, and executed 2 British men who he claimed were dangerous enemies. Jackson's move troubled the Monroe administration, but John Quincy Adams, the Secretary of the State at the time, negotiated the Adams-Oneida Treaty with Spain, which delivered Florida to the United States in 1819. In exchange, the United States agreed to abandon any claim to Texas or Cuba. After the crisis, Monroe decided that the U.S. needed to set some boundaries to avoid future retaliation from any European power. To discourage Spain or other Europeans from reconquering Chile, Colombia, Peru, or Mexico, Monroe formulated a Declaration of Principles on South America. The Monroe Doctrine warned Europe that any attempt to interfere in the Western Hemisphere would be regarded as an unfriendly act towards the United States. In exchange for non-interference by Europeans, Monroe pledged that the United States would stay out of European struggles. The result was what we call the Monroe Doctrine. The doctrine essentially asserted the United States' role as a major power in the Western Hemisphere. Another major crisis under the Monroe administration was the addition of the Missouri Territory to the Union. When Missouri applied for statehood, slavery became a contested issue. James Talmay Jr. proposed 2 amendments to the statehood bill. The first stipulated that slaves born in Missouri after statehood would be freed at the age of 25, and the second declared that no new slaves could be imported into the state. Talmadge's amendments passed in the House, but the Senate voted down the amendments. When Congress reconvened in 1820, a senator from Illinois, another new Western state, proposed a compromise. Jesse Thomas hoped his offer will not only end the Missouri crisis, but also prevent any future sectional disputes over slavery and statehood. Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky joined in promoting the deal, earning himself the nickname the Great Compromiser. Their idea will eventually become the Missouri Compromise of 1820. The compromise contained 3 parts. First, Congress will admit Missouri as a slave state. Second, Congress will admit Maine, which until now had been a territory of Massachusetts, as a free state, maintaining the balance between the number of free and slave states. Third, the rest of the Louisiana Purchase territory will be divided along the 3630 line of latitude, or in other words, along the southern border of Missouri. Slavery will be prohibited in other new states north of this line, but it will be permitted in new states to the south. The compromise passed both houses of Congress, and the Missouri crisis ended peacefully. The next presidential election will take place in 1824, and it will be a contested one. John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and William H. Crawford, each representing various segments of the population, all ran for the presidency in 1824. Adams was from Massachusetts, Jackson from Tennessee, William H. Crawford from Georgia, and Henry Clay from Kentucky. On this election, Jackson won more popular votes than anyone else. But with no majority winner in the Electoral College, the election was thrown into the House of Representatives. The 12th Amendment dictated that each congressional delegation had 1 vote, and only the top 3 candidates could enter the runoff. Adams was aware of the situation and used his political clout to claim the presidency, persuading Clay to support him. With Clay out of the race, he was well positioned to throw his support to Adams. Jackson will never forgive Adams, whom his supporters accused of engineering a corrupt bargain with Clay. What made Clay's decision look corrupt was that immediately after the election, Adams offered to appoint Clay Secretary of State, and Clay accepted. Although there was probably not a concrete bargain, Jackson felt the election had been stolen from him. The Adams administration will then end as soon as it had begun. John Quincy Adams' career had been built on diplomacy, not electoral politics. Adams lacked the political savvy to implement much of his program, and like his father, was fated to serve only one term as president. Adams had lofty ideas for federal action during his presidency, and the plan he put before Congress was so sweeping that many feared he was using federal power inappropriately to advance commercial interests. In conclusion, Jefferson's sponsorship of the Lewis and Clark expedition developed knowledge of the land and peoples beyond American borders. The War of 1812 had cultivated a profound sense of union among a diverse and divided people. Political limits continue along class, gender, and racial ethnic lines. More than anything else, however, it was racial inequality that exposed Americans' limits to its democracy. Over several decades, state governments had lowered their property requirements so poor men could vote. At the same time, industrialization and the development of American capitalism required new justifications for inequality. That is all for now, but stay tuned for the next video lecture.